When people talk about Missouri's cities, the conversation usually stops at decline. St. Louis, deindustrialization, population loss, crime statistics. The same tired narrative is repeated until it becomes the only story anyone knows how to tell. But while attention stayed fixed on what was falling, Kansas City was doing something else entirely. It wasn't reinventing itself loudly. It wasn't branding a comeback with glossy marketing campaigns. It wasn't begging for national attention or chasing viral moments. It was building quietly, deliberately, and without asking permission. And that's exactly why most people missed it. Kansas City's rise doesn't fit the American narrative about cities. There's no dramatic rescue, no celebrity mayor, no single moment when everything changed. Just steady, structural growth that accumulated while nobody was writing headlines about it. Today, we're breaking down 25 quiet truths about how Kansas City rose while no one was watching, and why that invisibility might be exactly what made it possible. Let's begin. Kansas City didn't collapse. It repositioned. Kansas City didn't experience the same kind of hollowing out narrative that defined other Midwestern cities. It didn't become a symbol of urban decay or a cautionary tale about industrial decline. The city lost industry, yes. Manufacturing jobs disappeared here, just like across the heartland. But Kansas City never lost function. It never lost its reason for existing. Instead of trying to return to the past and recapture manufacturing glory that wasn't coming back, Kansas City adjusted its role in the system. It pivoted toward logistics, healthcare, professional services, and regional coordination. That decision to reposition rather than restore changed everything. Kansas City stopped mourning what was lost and started building on what remained. 2. Geography gave Kansas City flexibility. Kansas City is not locked into frozen borders the way St. Louis is. That geographic fact shaped everything that followed. When suburban growth happened, when families moved outward seeking space, schools, and affordability, Kansas City could expand to capture that movement. The city annexed surrounding areas, absorbed population growth, and maintained tax-base connections to development at its edges. St. Louis watched suburban growth happen outside its boundaries, beyond its reach. Kansas City incorporated suburban growth into its structure. That flexibility created resilience without generating headlines. Nobody writes articles about successful annexation policy. But the cumulative effect over decades was profound. Kansas City grew while maintaining the ability to fund services and infrastructure. Kansas City became a logistics powerhouse without marketing it. Rail networks converge in Kansas City. Interstate highways intersect here. Trucking routes crisscross the metropolitan area. Warehousing and distribution facilities sprawl across the region. Kansas City sits at one of the most efficient crossroads in the continental United States. Moving goods through Kansas City is cheaper, faster, and more practical than most alternative routes. But logistics does not make sexy headlines. It does not attract lifestyle magazine coverage or generate social media buzz. Nobody moves to a city because it has excellent freight rail connections. So Kansas City's logistics dominance grew quietly. The city became essential to supply chains without becoming famous for it. That is the opposite of how most cities pursue growth, and it worked. Logistics makes money. It just does not make noise. The city bet on stability instead of spectacle. Other struggling cities chased moonshot projects. They built stadiums hoping for economic transformation. They launched desperate rebranding campaigns. They recruited celebrity architects for signature buildings that would change everything. Kansas City didn't do that. Instead, the city invested in gradual redevelopment, infrastructure maintenance, regional cooperation, and boring, incremental improvements that do not generate ribbon-cutting ceremonies or press conferences. Stability doesn't trend on social media. It doesn't win awards for urban innovation. It doesn't attract the attention of journalists looking for dramatic transformation stories. But stability compounds. Year after year of steady improvement accumulates into something substantial. Kansas City bet on the long game, and the long game is finally paying off in ways that spectacle never could. 5. Sports changed the city's psychology, not its economy. When the Kansas City Chiefs won Super Bowls and the Royals won a World Series, something shifted, but not what most people assume. Championships did not save Kansas City economically. Stadium revenues and tourist spending do not transform regional economies at scale. The direct economic impact was real, but modest. What changed was psychology, how Kansas City saw itself, how residents talked about their city, how civic pride resurfaced after decades of being overshadowed by coastal attention. Confidence came back. Investment felt safer because investors sensed optimism rather than resignation. Young professionals became more willing to stay rather than automatically leaving for real cities elsewhere. Sports did not rescue Kansas City. They reset the city's internal narrative, and internal narratives shape external outcomes more than most people realize. 6. Kansas City learned from St. Louis without competing with it. This part is rarely said out loud because it sounds like criticism of a sister city. But Kansas City watched what happened east and made different structural choices. Kansas City did not freeze its footprint. It kept expanding boundaries to capture growth. It did not centralize decline within fixed borders. It distributed challenges across a larger geographic area where they could be managed. Most importantly, Kansas City did not let narrative outrun reality. It did not become defined by a decline story that then shaped expectations and investment decisions. Learning from St. Louis was not rivalry, it was observation. Kansas City saw patterns and chose different paths, not because St. Louis was wrong, but because Kansas City had options St. Louis did not. Kansas City's rise didn't hinge on one miracle district. There was no single neighborhood that transformed and dragged the entire city upward. Instead, growth spread. Downtown revitalization happened gradually. Suburban corridors developed commercial bases. Regional connections strengthened economic ties across municipal lines. Multiple neighborhoods improved simultaneously rather than sequentially. Distributed growth does not explode. It does not create the dramatic before and after photographs that viral urban transformation stories require. But distributed growth holds. It creates resilience because no single failure point can collapse the entire system. When growth spreads across a metropolitan area, setbacks in one zone do not cascade into regional crisis. Kansas City grew everywhere a little rather than somewhere a lot. That's not exciting, but it's durable. The city never tried to become something it wasn't. Kansas City didn't chase coastal identity. It didn't try to become the next Austin or Portland or Brooklyn. It didn't imitate tech hubs that operate under completely different economic conditions. Instead, Kansas City leaned into what it actually was: affordable compared to coastal alternatives, livable in ways that density-obsessed cities can't match, functional in the practical sense of systems that work reliably. That's not flashy. It doesn't generate thought pieces about urban innovation. It doesn't attract the creative class mythologies that urbanists love to write about. But it's durable. Kansas City built on genuine strengths rather than aspirational identities borrowed from elsewhere. Authenticity turns out to be more sustainable than imitation, even when imitation gets more attention. 9. Kansas City became attractive without advertising itself. People moved to Kansas City quietly. They discovered affordability, job opportunities, and quality of life through personal networks rather than marketing campaigns. Jobs arrived quietly too. Companies relocated or expanded operations without press release fanfare. The business case was obvious, with lower costs, a central location, and functional infrastructure. and it did not require aggressive recruitment. National attention stayed elsewhere. Kansas City was not featured in Best Cities listicles or targeted by think pieces about urban transformation. That's the sweet spot for sustainable growth. Attention brings speculation, price inflation, and pressure to perform. Absence of attention creates space to build without distortion. Kansas City grew while nobody was writing about it, and that might be exactly why the growth proved sustainable. 10. The city benefited from being ignored. This sounds backwards, but it's true. Most cities chase attention. They hire consultants to improve their brand. They compete for rankings and recognition. They treat visibility as inherently valuable, but spotlight creates pressure. Attention attracts speculation. Visibility invites comparison to places operating under completely different conditions. Kansas City being ignored meant fewer speculative real estate bubbles driven by outside investment, less political pressure to deliver dramatic results quickly, more room to experiment without national scrutiny, freedom to fail quietly and adjust without embarrassment. Kansas City grew without being forced to perform. The city did not have to satisfy national expectations or prove itself to coastal observers. Sometimes being ignored is the best possible development condition. If you appreciate breakdowns that go beyond rise and fall headlines, subscribe to Hard Truth Untold. This channel exists to explain how places actually change, not just how they are described in narratives designed for entertainment rather than accuracy. Most channels tell the simple version. We dig into what actually happened. Hit subscribe and let's continue. 11. Kansas City's economy is boring, and that's the point. Kansas City does not have a signature industry. No single sector dominates the way tech dominates San Francisco or finance dominates New York. Instead, Kansas City has healthcare systems serving regional populations, logistics networks moving goods nationally, manufacturing operations that never fully disappeared, professional services supporting diverse client bases, agricultural connections to surrounding farm economies. Economic diversity does not excite narratives. There is no clean story to tell about a healthcare city or a logistics capital. Diversity protects cities. When one sector struggles, others compensate. When national trends favor certain industries, Kansas City usually has exposure. When trends shift, the damage spreads rather than concentrates. Boring economies survive. Exciting economies often do not. 12. The city did not need a comeback story. Comeback stories require collapse first. The narrative demands a dramatic fall before an inspiring rise. That is what makes them satisfying to consume. Kansas City never provided that collapse. It declined, but not dramatically. It struggled, but not cinematically. It never became a symbol of urban failure requiring redemption. So Kansas City avoided the comeback label entirely. It did not have to climb out of a narrative hole before making progress. It just kept moving forward, without first moving backward far enough to generate sympathy. That is less exciting for storytellers, but it is better for residents. Not needing a comeback means not experiencing the collapse that makes comebacks necessary. Kansas City spans two states, Missouri and Kansas. Municipal boundaries fragment the metropolitan area into dozens of jurisdictions with different governments, tax structures, and priorities. That could have been fatal. Fragmentation often paralyzes regions, creating competition that undermines collective benefit. But Kansas City developed regional cooperation mechanisms that transcended boundaries. Economic development happened through coordination rather than competition. Infrastructure investments connected rather than divided. Municipal boundaries mattered less than they could have because regional thinking emerged alongside local governance. That reduced friction and reduced headlines. Nobody writes articles about successful intergovernmental cooperation, but the absence of dysfunction enabled growth that would otherwise have been prevented. 14. Kansas City was built to adapt, not dominate. Kansas City was never meant to command the nation. It was not positioned to become a capital of finance, culture, or political power. Its geography made it central, not supreme. That design, functional rather than dominant, aged better than dominance would have. Cities built for dominance struggle when conditions shift. They are optimized for specific eras that inevitably end. When the era passes, dominance becomes a burden, with legacy costs, outdated infrastructure, and expectations that cannot be met. Kansas City was built to function inside systems, not command them. That flexibility allowed adaptation when systems changed. The city could adjust because it was not locked into a specific role that no longer existed. Adaptation beats dominance over long time horizons. 15. The food, music, and culture followed stability. Kansas City's cultural renaissance, including barbecue recognition, the jazz heritage celebration, and emerging food scenes, did not lead the city's recovery. Culture followed stability. Artists, chefs, musicians, and creatives moved into neighborhoods that had already stabilized. They built on foundations that economic development had created. That is why Kansas City's cultural growth feels authentic rather than forced. It emerged organically from improved conditions rather than being manufactured to attract investment. Cities that try to lead with culture often produce hollow results. They create arts districts that feel artificial and food scenes that cater to tourists rather than residents. Kansas City built stability first and let culture emerge from it naturally. The sequence matters. Kansas City got it right. Kansas City didn't replace St. Louis, it complemented it. The temptation is to tell a rivalry story. One city rises while another falls. Missouri's power shifts westward. Kansas City wins what St. Louis lost. But that is not what happened. Missouri did not trade one city for another. It redistributed weight across a more balanced system. St. Louis still matters, economically, culturally, and historically. Kansas City's rise did not require St. Louis's fall. The two cities serve different functions, connect to different regions, and face different challenges. They are not competing for the same role. They are occupying complementary positions in a state that needs both. Rivalry narratives are satisfying, but misleading. Missouri's reality is more complicated and more sustainable than zero-sum competition. 17. Kansas City benefits from lower expectations. No one demanded that Kansas City become New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. The city was not measured against impossible standards borrowed from completely different contexts. That freedom from unrealistic expectations allowed Kansas City to define success on its own terms. Growth could be celebrated without being dismissed as insufficient. Improvements could be acknowledged without being compared to transformations happening elsewhere under different conditions. Lower expectations meant Kansas City did not burn energy trying to satisfy external benchmarks that did not fit. The city could focus on what actually mattered to residents rather than what impressed distant observers. Expectation management is not glamorous, but it determines whether achievement feels like success or failure, and feelings shape behavior. Affordability became an advantage, not a red flag. In overheated housing markets, affordability often signals undesirability. If a city is cheap, people assume something is wrong. Prices are seen as value, so low prices mean low value. Kansas City inverted that logic. Affordability meant lower risk for people starting careers or businesses, longer timelines. Before financial pressure forced decisions, real ownership possibilities for middle-income residents, genuine wealth building rather than rent extraction that attracted builders, people interested in creating rather than just consuming. It repelled speculators looking for quick returns in overheated markets. Affordable does not mean stagnant when affordability attracts the right kind of growth. Kansas City proved that cheap can be a strategy, not a symptom. 19. Kansas City is growing without erasing itself. Rapid growth often destroys what made places attractive. Neighborhoods get demolished for development. Character gets sacrificed for density. Long-term residents get displaced by newcomers who arrived seeking authenticity they then eliminate. Kansas City's slower growth avoided that trap. Neighborhoods evolved instead of being replaced. Development happened through renovation and infill rather than wholesale clearance. Communities that existed before growth continued existing after. That slows growth, but preserves identity. Kansas City is still recognizable to people who knew it decades ago. The city grew without becoming unrecognizable to itself. Preservation is not anti-growth. It is sustainable growth. Kansas City found the balance. 20. The city refused to be defined by national narratives. Kansas City doesn't fit easy categories. It is not a Rust Belt comeback story. It was never Rust Belt. It is not an urban collapse cautionary tale. It never collapsed. It is not a Sun Belt boomtown. It is not Sun Belt. National narratives about cities do not accommodate Kansas City. The templates do not fit. The storylines do not apply. So Kansas City refused definition. It kept moving forward without conforming to frameworks designed for other places. That made the city harder to write about, which reduced coverage, which reduced pressure, and which enabled continued growth. Refusing narrative definition is not just stubbornness. It is strategic freedom. Number 21. Kansas City's success is hard to headline. Journalists need hooks. Editors need drama. Readers need stories with clear inflection points. Kansas City doesn't provide those. There is no dramatic moment when everything changed. No single decision that reversed decades of decline. No charismatic leader who deserves credit. No viral moment that captured transformation. Just decades of steady improvement. Incremental gains. Boring decisions that accumulated into something substantial. That is impossible to headline. A headline that reads, "City continues gradual improvement does not drive traffic." So the improvement continues without generating the coverage that would bring attention. Kansas City succeeded in ways journalism cannot capture, which means the success remains largely unreported. Missouri's future isn't either-or, it's both. The temptation is to pick sides. St. Louis represents Missouri's past. Kansas City represents its future. One city's loss is another's gain. But Missouri's future isn't either-or. It's both. St. Louis shows what happens when systems freeze, when borders can't adapt, when narrative overwhelms reality, when structural constraints prevent adjustment. Kansas City shows what happens when systems flex, when expansion remains possible, when cooperation crosses boundaries, when expectations stay realistic. Missouri needs both lessons. The state's future depends on learning from St. Louis's constraints and Kansas City's adaptability. Neither city alone tells the whole story. Kansas City proves growth doesn't have to be loud. American culture celebrates loud growth, the headline-grabbing transformation, the dramatic before and after, the story that writes itself. Kansas City proves growth doesn't need volume. It just needs to last. Sustainable growth is usually quiet. It accumulates through decisions that don't generate press releases. It compounds through improvements that nobody photographs. Loud growth attracts attention, speculation, and pressure that often undermine sustainability. Quiet growth continues, uninterrupted, because nobody is watching closely enough to interfere. Kansas City grew quietly, and that quietness protected the growth from forces that destroy louder transformations. 24. The city is strong because it did not need to be seen. Visibility creates pressure. When cities become objects of national attention, They must perform for audiences that do not live there and do not understand local conditions. Kansas City did not need to be seen. It did not need validation from coastal observers or approval from national media. It could focus on serving residents rather than satisfying distant critics. Invisibility creates space. Space to experiment. Space to fail. Space to adjust without embarrassment. Space to build without performing. Kansas City's strength came partly from not needing external validation. The city built for itself, and that self-direction proved more sustainable than chasing approval that would never fully arrive. 25. Kansas City is rising quietly, and that's exactly why it's working. No mythology supports Kansas City's rise, no legend of transformation, no heroic narrative of rescue and redemption, just structure. Infrastructure that works, governance that cooperates, economy that diversifies, growth that distributes. It's not romantic. It doesn't inspire movies or books or think pieces about urban renaissance, but it works. It lasts. It compounds. Kansas City figured out something most cities miss. Success doesn't require spectacle. Progress doesn't require performance. Growth doesn't require attention. Sometimes the best development strategy is building quietly while everyone watches somewhere else. Kansas City rose while no one was watching, and that's exactly why it's still rising. If you're from Kansas City, does this match what you've experienced? Does it capture the reality beneath the relative media silence? And if you're from St. Louis or elsewhere in Missouri, do you see these two cities differently now? Does the comparison illuminate rather than divide? Drop your perspective in the comments. Different experiences matter here. The conversation needs people who actually know these places. The next episode in this Missouri Cities series looks at the Ozarks and why people keep getting them wrong. Subscribe to Hard Truth Untold, because not all power announces itself. And sometimes the cities that rise quietest rise furthest.